Secretary of Energy Jennifer Granholm said we need we need carbon dioxide removal to restore our climate.
Right.
Which is the first time any U.S. official or any government official anywhere has talked about actually restoring the Earth's climate.
Okay.
And when I talk to people, I imagine it's true for you that people really do want to restore a climate that humans have actually survived.
Mm-hmm.
And the UN, of course, is proposing a climate of 1.5 or 2 or 3 degrees, which is way beyond what humans have survived. And we might, but I'm sorry, it's just not what we want.
Yeah, yeah.
With all due respect to the United Nations, and the various agencies. And so, what we need to do is get 1 trillion tons of CO2 out of the atmosphere to get it back to what I call a safe harbor.
Can you say that? Did you say 2 trillion tons? Was that the number?
1 trillion tons is what I say. In fact, it's sort of closer to 2 trillion, but it gets a little iffy. But we know 1 trillion.
Yeah, and also as you draw down, you start to release carbon out of the ocean. Is that
Precisely.
Right? Yeah. Okay.
Right.
All right. But we're talking in the ballpark of 1 trillion to 2 trillion tons of CO2 pulled harmlessly out of the environment out of the atmosphere to stabilize, to bring climate back to the safe zone of the Holocene epoch.
Yeah. So I use the term a safe harbor. And the idea is when a ship is in stormy seas, the captain will go to the nearest safe harbor. Mm-hmm. And some PhD mate is going to say, hey, I know this great place, this island, it's beautiful, there are palm trees. And the captain says, no, I'm going to the safe harbor, the place where I've been before. And I don't care how many PhDs you have, I'm going to where I've been before. And that's what we're doing with the climate, is that we've actually we know that the Holocene works. So that's what we're going to do.
Yeah, love it. Love that. It's just simple. And, I've actually been doing these interviews over the last few days. I've talked to the polar researcher, Peter Wadhams, and seeing what's happening. Whatever it is that you're planning on doing, it needs to happen quickly. I think that's a really important point as well.
Yes.
And the 2 trillion tons has to come out in the next, 28 years or something by 2050.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I've got
a few.
Go on.
A few details there is you only need to pull out 1 trillion by 2050 or by 2040 because the other trillion or half trillion will take 50 years to come out of the ocean.
I see. Okay. And there are still these processes that are drawing down into the soils, into the forests, if they're allowed to grow, right?
Probably, although I wouldn't want to bet our kids' lives on that.
Right. Okay. Okay. And so how is this, and this is all going to happen just by using the mechanisms of the global marketplace through investments and effectively a cost, not only cost effective, but a profitable process that's what you've got planned. Is that right?
Yeah, although saying using the marketplace leaves a misleading feeling because when you say that for the cognoscenti, sort of like you and me, we think of the carbon market.
Right, yes.
And the carbon market's not going to work. Why? Because right now, when a company buys a ton of carbon offsets in the carbon market, that they emit an extra ton, and then someone else promises to remove that ton. So there's no impact.
Yeah.
And so no matter how much you fund with carbon offsets, you're not reducing CO2.
Yeah.
Then when we finish the energy transition, there's no more money.
Yeah.
Because there's no more fossil fuel and no more offsets. And now you still have 1 trillion tons of CO2.
Excess in the atmosphere. Okay, so firstly, can I just say I really love that word cognoscenti. I want to use that myself. And secondly, when I said the marketplace, I guess what I meant was by going to the market and actually seeking investors that would put money into projects and that there'd be a financial return
Yes. Yeah.
Which is obviously how the world works, right? So trying to find billions and billions and millions of dollars for a project that's not going to give a financial return is a lot harder than finding money for an investment.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I like to say it this way, that we got into this mess because in our market economy, companies said, listen, I hear you want to buy some energy to heat your house, to run your business. Here's some energy. Oh, by the way, it'll put CO2 in the air. And then you can, these same customers, we can say, listen, if you want to buy some limestone, well, you can buy some limestone. It'll take each cubic yard of concrete will take a ton of CO2 out of the air.
Yeah.
And the customer says, fine, works for me.
I don't care,
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or buy the salmon.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, good. That salmon was involved in taking 100 million tons of CO2 out of the atmosphere. Fine. I want that. I love salmon. So,
right. And my plan was to spread a global spiritual movement that everybody started caring. And you're saying we don't really need that with your model.
That's true.
Well, that's good.
Yeah. And be a part of it, though, Guy, is when you need to care, you don't, right? Because we're all kids at heart. We're all 2-year-olds. No.
Yeah.
But if you don't need to care, you can count on everybody caring.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Hey. Okay. So I've got a slide that I found on your slide deck that comes with your email. Can I just bring that up for a second, because it outlines some of the methods that you're planning on using. So if I go to share screen and I go to here, can you see that?
Yes. Yes.
Can you just walk us through each of those pieces of pie?
Yeah. So the net zero by 2040 refers to accelerating the energy transition.
Yeah.
And that's 6% of the total amount of CO2 that we need to remove. And so the point there is that it's not a big deal. The energy transition. It's important for health reasons. It's important for environmental reasons. But as you can see, if we, for some bizarre reason, we fail to do it, it would not impact climate restoration significantly.
Because you're sucking such vast sums of CO2 out of the atmosphere, the 30 gigatons that the humans are putting up becomes immaterial.
That's right. It's material, but not a big deal. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
And when you read the book, if you've read the book, the second chapter is about the energy transition. And in a market economy that we have, the lower cost supplier tends to win. Now, in the case of energy, it takes 20 years to replace the capital equipment we use to do energy. And so it'll take 20 years to do that transition. But wind and solar and batteries are so much cheaper. Especially when you include the wars.
And like I've been surprised at how slow the transition has been, in recognition of how inexpensive the renewables are. But that's because of this like overt political manipulation in the economy. Like we've had this Liberal government in Australia that's just done everything in its power to stop a natural transition. And so that seems to be kind of waning as the cost differences gets greater and greater.
Yes. Yeah. And they can only do so much. So coal is on its way out, and Australia is going to transition from coal. Right? Everyone knows that.
Yeah.
And yes, they'll be able to delay it for another 4 years. That if they accelerated it, but in the grand scheme of things, 4 or 5 years is not that big a deal.
Yeah. Okay. So methane oxidation.
Methane oxidation. That's interesting. Once I figured out the other three, the iron fertilization, the kelp and sargassum, and the limestone, I realized that we are on our way to getting CO2 down to the safe harbor.
Mm-hmm.
And then I woke up in the middle of the night and said, oh my God, the methane burst. And when I first heard about that 8 years ago, I said, that's terrible. And I looked around and everyone said, that's terrible. Let's forget it because we don't know what to do.
Yeah.
And that might happen in the next century. But then about 3 years ago, they discovered these big bucket-sized bubbles, methane bubbles coming out of the Arctic. And they realized that the methane burst was happening.
Yeah.
The temperatures in the water there are 10 degrees Celsius. So, just with the ocean that warm, you're going to get a burst. Hopefully, it'll be a small burst, but hoping for our kids is unacceptable.
Yeah.
It turns out that the way nature deals with methane is it oxidizes it in the atmosphere. There are certain chemicals which act essentially as catalysts. It's not quite catalysts, but that's close enough for us. And we can increase that oxidation rate. It looks like by a factor of 2 or 3 times, and it buys us one that it'll if the methane burst is bad, we can oxidize it before we lose more than 1 or 2 harvests, which then saves our civilization.
Yeah.
The second is also very cool, that if we double the oxidation rate, that cools the atmosphere back to what it was around 2000.
Right.
Which is phenomenal.
Yes, because around a third of the radiative forcing is coming from methane already.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
And the cost of doing that looks like it'll be all of $1 billion a year total.
Okay. And how's that done? Is that by releasing something into the atmosphere or?
Yeah, exactly. That it's iron chloride. I think one of my scientist friends says that he's patenting a better way of doing it, but he won't tell me until the patent is registered or something.
Okay.
But it doesn't matter. The iron chloride is fine. It gets the chlorine atoms into the atmosphere. The sunlight activates it, and then chlorine, like chlorine bleach, will oxidize a methane molecule.
Okay. And the ocean iron fertilization is basically putting tiny trace amounts of iron across large sections of the ocean, which then fosters a rapid bloom of phytoplankton. Is that correct?
That's pretty correct. Large is a relative term. Specifically, it's about 1% of the ocean is required, and they do it in eddies so that it's contained. So rather than transforming the whole ocean, which is a nightmare, you're just transforming an eddy for 6 months, which is and that's what nature does.
Yeah.
But here's the cool thing: the amount of iron dust, so it's basically iron ore dust, just the same as similar to a volcano, is about 1/100 of a teaspoon per square meter. So imagine sweeping off your front porch. That's probably over a teaspoon. This is 100.
You could just get that up by sweeping up the railways in the Pilbara region in northwestern Australia.
that would be a disaster, disastrously too much.
Too much, yes.
Yes.
Okay. Do you know if Twiggy Forrest from the Minderoo Foundation is involved in this? Because he's one of Australia's leading philanthropists, environmental philanthropists, and also involved in the iron ore industry.
I don't know. I haven't heard his name in this.
Yeah, Twiggy Andrew Forrest. The company is called Fortescue Metals, and his foundation is called Minderoo, and they put in the order of 300 million Australian into mainly environmental projects, which is quite extraordinary for philanthropy. Philanthropy is not so well established in Australia as in the United States.
Yeah. So that's 300 million Australian, which is that 150
200 or so. Yeah, about 200 American.
200. Okay.
And Minderoo Foundation, Twiggy Forrest, and Fortescue Metals he's also leading a big movement to. He and another Australian businessman philanthropist are putting together this program to build this massive solar farm in northwestern Australia to send electricity on an undersea cable to Singapore.
To Singapore. I love that one.
Yeah. What's Yeah. Anyway, so that's an interesting connection there.
Yeah. Yeah. Are you connected with him at all?
Not yet. We've been sort of meaning to put some material together to go to him to help find some support for Vita, but we haven't actually got that far yet.
Okay. Well, I'm going to wait until you connect us, just because,
Okay.
given that you're both Australian, that counts.
Yep. Okay, yeah. That's good. Good. Kelp and sargassum, and again, I understand this is ocean-based, where you're basically growing out vast amounts of macroalgae, which have got a huge capacity to suck CO2 out of the ocean, therefore the atmosphere.
Yeah. Yes. So that's our plan A is ocean fertilization, because that's what nature uses to produce ice ages. So it's been tested 10 times. If you look at the Keeling curve, after the Mount Pinatubo volcano in 1991, you can see the curve goes up, flattens for a year and a half, and then goes back up again. And that flattening is about 4 parts per million is almost certainly due to the iron from the volcanic dust.
Yeah, right. Okay.
The point is that's why it's plan A. Kelp and sargassum is our plan C. It's the same idea. You photosynthesis in the ocean, and the biocarbon sinks to the middle or the bottom of the ocean. But it's a lot more expensive, and so because you need structures and activity. But it's good to have a plan C. The synthetic limestone is plan B. And that's what nature does over 100 million years to sequester 99% of the carbon on our planet under the ocean, formed from the skeletons and shells of animals and plants.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, that's fantastic. And so, how can you tell me how these are progressing in terms of? Is there like publicly listed company that's doing an investment round, or how is this operationalizing?
The things are beginning to pick up. The synthetic limestone is way ahead. They raised around of about 100 million last year, US. Yeah. And because they produce limestone, here's some of their limestone.
Okay. Yep.
And and it's for sale. The San Francisco airport has bought most of their production for the next year or two, and they have got a whole lot of other projects. And they're building new plants in several places in the world right now.
And this is predominantly for like road base, is that correct?
For roads and buildings. So the San Francisco airport used it in one of their temporary terminals. So they didn't want to do it for a permanent terminal, but they had a temporary addition. They said, good, we can certify this for the next 3 or 4 years. They tore it down and were completely delighted.
Yeah, wow. Okay,
which is not surprising, because it's pure. Whereas when you get limestone from the ground, it's sort of dirty. Yeah. And so there's a certain amount of uncertainty about what you're going to get.
Yeah. Okay. Wow, that's good stuff. And how is this? So tell me about the foundation, the Climate Restoration Foundation. Is that the charity through which these activities have been promoted?
The Foundation for Climate Restoration. There's an Australian group called the Climate Restoration Foundation.
Okay.
It's a little bit different.
Yeah. Right. Yes.
And so ours is called F4CI, the Foundation for Climate Restoration.
Okay, yeah.
And they're focusing on the sort of the advocacy. So they've put together school curricula to teach students about climate restoration, and especially to have the young people expect that we're going to restore the climate. Sort of like, when I was a youth, we expected that we would stop the Vietnam War, and eventually we did. But that expectation makes all the difference. And knowing how to do it helps too. So they're doing that. They're working with governments around the world to promote the limestone, and they're beginning to, just in the last few months, promote the iron fertilization. Okay. Because the iron fertilization becomes the plankton it grows is food for fish.
Yeah.
And so it restores fisheries, which is a big deal.
Yeah. And it would also assist to assisting in, and by pulling this carbon out of the atmosphere, it's helping to ameliorate ocean acidification as well. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
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 And well, the other thing it does is the phytoplankton produce this compound, this protein called DMS, which it becomes a seed for clouds.
Yes. So you're cloud brightening.
Yeah, what they discovered, they'd seen this in the earlier tests, but they really saw it in 2012 in the Gulf of Alaska test, which was the first one that was at a real operational scale. Is they could barely get measurements from the satellites of how much phytoplankton was growing because it was always cloudy.
And of course, that's increasing albedo, which is increasing the reflectivity of sunlight, which cools the ocean, which goes to help.
Right.
Oh, that's great stuff. Okay.
Yeah. And to some degree, it'll cool the Great Barrier Reef.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, sooner rather than later there.
Yes. Yeah.
So how far are you advanced in actually deploying large scale into ocean eddies with ocean fertilization?
Well, the group doing that's called OPR World, Ocean Pasture Restoration, because that's what they do. When the ocean goes from blue to green, and they tell me it smells like a new mown pasture. That there's so much growing there. Yeah. So they named the company OPR World, and they've got 5 to 10 sites. They tell me that are getting ready to go. They're keeping it on the quiet because there was a lot of bad press 10 years ago. Yeah. I don't see any signs of bad press right now, but we adults get scared. And so that's why I'm not releasing any data about it. But a year from now, we should see several tests, especially in places where they need the fish. Yeah,
sure. And what you're describing with open ocean and the eddies, which are these self-contained bodies of water, that if there is anything goes wrong, it's constrained and it's probably a long way from anything. So I love it. Yeah. Oh, this is very buoyant news, particularly after my conversation yesterday with Peter Wadhams talking about the methane burst we talked about, and all of the stuff that's going on in the Arctic, which is such a dynamic player in the global climate. But here we have human ingenuity and the pressures of the marketplace working in our advantage for the first time.
Yeah. And I've been doing testing on the methane oxidation, the iron chloride. And so I actually, I was out of my office for a few months during renovations here, and did some tests and got reliable measurements of methane oxidation using UV lights to simulate sunlight and the iron chloride. Wow. So we're looking for funding still, but it looks very promising. Wow. The funding in the short term will come from carbon offsets. But as we were saying earlier, the carbon offsets are a temporary solution. But we expect that the reinsurance companies will put money in, and also family offices, because the insurance losses have gone from 40 billion a year to 80 billion in the last 20 years. And so it looks like we can restore the cooling back to 20 years ago. We could probably save them $40 billion a year by cooling the planet down. And for they're investing $1 billion a year in the iron chloride, I think will be an easy sell. Wow.
Another good reason to talk to our friends in Northwestern Australia on more iron.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Now, the amount is pathetic. So it's 100 million tons. Yeah. No, it's 1 million tons a year is what we expect. There'll probably be a third or a tenth of that, but we want to estimate on the high side. And then on the iron fertilization, oh my God, I haven't done that calculation in a long time, but it's also way less than 1 million tons a year.
Yeah. Okay. The famous quote I remember was, "Give me a super tanker full of iron, and I'll give you an ice age."
That's right. That's right. Actually, it was give me a half a tanker of iron, and I'll give you the next ice age. I love that. I love that. It's just it's so smart to use vivid images.
Yeah. Okay, that's great, Peter. It's been really great chatting with you. I'm going to wind this up now. But with a view that we could come and have another chat a little bit further down, and I'll do some research into these things and come up with some sort of targeted questions.
Yeah, and I've got some new slides. I'll send you the new slides.
Okay, great, fantastic. And it's great to talk to you at last.
It is. Yeah, thanks for the call. Thanks for the work that you do. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you very much. Okay. And I'll talk soon.
Okay, very good. Thanks, Guy. Have a good afternoon. Okay, bye.
What's it saying? Amy, how you going?
I'm good, Guy. How are you?
Very well indeed. We were just having a conversation about the intersection between naturopathy and spirituality, and a couple of little terms that I've come across in my research into this is this idea of biopsychosocial spiritual. Can you explain what that is?
Well, I think it's a modern attempt to try and give a more specific title to the concept of holism. And holism is a core philosophical tenet of naturopathy. And it acknowledges that you can't engage with anyone's healing journey without accepting that they are a biological, psychological, social, and spiritual being. And so imbalances in any of those areas in someone's life can impede their ability to be fully well in all its forms. And so that's really the idea of that. And so it's not to say that we center spirituality in a naturopathic healing consultation or treatment plan, but we acknowledge it, and where the person is open to having that conversation, we support and encourage them to have an enriched spiritual life, whatever that means for them.
Yeah, and it's that whatever that means for them, which is a really kind of difficult part of a conversation about spirituality, but it's not completely unframed. So what I've seen here, again, just in my little bits of reading, that in the context of naturopathy, then spirituality is referring to values, beliefs, identity, and purpose. And it's sort of that inner, one of those expressions is the inner self, that sort of stuff that is deeply seated in us. And so what they're saying as well is, just to use one of these quotes here, that, what was it? So whatever one needs to fill one's spiritual coffers. And for some people, that might be going to a church, but for other people, it might be going to a forest. And it's obviously the forest part, which is of the greatest interest to Vita Sapien. So values, beliefs, identity, and purpose. Would you add anything to that list? Is that how you'd frame it?
Yeah, I think so. I think the idea, particularly, the naturopathic approach is incredibly person-centered. And so there's a real emphasis on working within the value system of the person that you're providing care for. But the examples that you gave are really great, because one of the things, and I guess this is a slight deviation from your question, but the naturopathy not only recognizes that people can have a spiritual engagement with nature, they actually recognize that engaging with nature is actually a healing experience unto itself. And there's a heap of science around it, but even at a level that science as yet cannot measure, there's a healing element of just being in a natural space. And that is one of the principles of naturopathic practice. So we've got core philosophical tenets that underpin everything that we do, and holism being one of them. Mm-hmm. But we've got 7 accepted naturopathic principles, and one of those is the healing power of nature.
Right. And just and And of course, nature is a really interesting word that I've had to define a few times because, and I'll just deviate here just to come back to this point. If a monkey uses a stick to get ants out of an ant's nest, then you could say that the use of the tool is natural. And by definition, the development of nuclear weapons is also natural if you're following. So nature needs to be defined, if you know what I'm saying. Nature also involves black holes and subatomic particles, but that's not really what we're talking about when we're talking about nature. We're talking about being in landscapes, coastlines, forests, streams, rivers, and so forth. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, yes, absolutely. Naturopaths do deal really well with complexity. They non-linear thinking and understanding complex systems is a really critical component of how naturopaths understand the health of a person and the world that they live in. And so as a result, most of those things that we do are layered. So in the concept of the healing power of nature, there's the fact that using natural treatments or treatments that are derived from as close to the naturally occurring source as possible is the preferred way to start a treatment. So we actually draw on nature to provide treatment, but we also accept that being in nature is part of treatment. It's a multi-layered view. But yes, in the term that you're talking about, landscapes, environments, going for a walk on the beach, getting some fresh air, it doesn't have to be locking yourself in a log cabin for a month. It's just simply a case of out, touching a few trees as you're walking down the street and just having that contact with the natural growing world that surrounds us, but we're often so disconnected from.
Yeah, lovely. And of course, that sort of suggests that maybe a lot of the ailments that we have that we need curing from, if you like, are actually sort of caused by the technosphere in a way. The fact that we live surrounded by stuff that we've built and tarmac and concrete and motor vehicles and exhaust is sort of, part of this underlying, health issue is the fact that we actually live in the thing that we've created, and that we've had to actually push aside natural landscapes in order to build it, and it comes back to a term that I'll quote this. It's from, I read this years and years ago and it just stuck in my mind. Let me see if I can just find the quote. This was in the conquistadors that went into South America, the Spanish Hernan Cortez, said to one of these Mayans or one of these indigenous tribe people, he says, "I and my companions suffer from a disease of the heart, which can only be cured with gold." And that was the explanation of why it was that they were prepared to rape and murder and kill millions of people, because and again, it comes back to this disease of the heart, the soul, the spirit. And part of the conversation I was having yesterday on Zoom with Dr. Peter Carter, who's a physician, but is also an expert IPCC reviewer, so for the climate change reports. And we were talking about oil men, fossil fuel executives who continue to perpetuate this ecocidal industry, and how what's fundamentally wrong or allowing them to do that work is that there is something spiritually out of balance with them. Or out of balance with respect to nature, obviously not out of balance with respect to making money and power. Okay. And so I guess what I'm sort of seeing here, that through this spiritual angle of naturopathy, you've actually got a way of sort of explaining the destruction of the global ecosystem because of this spiritual disease of the heart that many people have. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I think so. And I think it's not always going to be the cause of the condition, but it is always going to be getting in the way of the healing. And so putting someone, no matter what their underlying cause is, and we're always looking for the underlying cause. It's one of our other principles, is treat the cause, not the symptoms. And so we're always looking for that, and we're looking deep, and there's a lot of detective work that's going on around it. And it's very, very rarely, particularly these days, with so much non-communicable disease, so much chronic illness, it's very rarely just one thing.
Yeah.
It's actually not even just two things. It's a multitude of things that either exacerbate or enhance in some way the severity of the person's health issues. So I think that and being a part of nature, being connected with nature, having some space away from the technological penetration of our life, is a big part of that. And I think that, yes, it does play out in lots of other areas. It creates the psychological imbalances that disconnection from nature creates, can, I think, lead to some of the things that you're talking about. People making decisions that are not based on respect for the life cycle of the planet and of humanity. And so that they end up so disconnected from simple rhythms of life that they can't seem to make decisions that actually respected it anyway.
Yeah, okay, that's really good stuff. That's and that makes a lot of sense. Back to this idea of the spiritual coffers, and so in my Vita Sapien, the booklet that I write, one of the little passages that I keep coming back to and finessing is that the many different things that we can put into our spiritual coffers, like a little chamber that you can open up, like a sea chest, and you put different things in. And what we've sort of been trying to sort of put forward is that you've got to have a bunch of nature sitting at the bottom of that. It doesn't matter if you're spiritually connected, by things that aren't nature. That's not really the problem so much as that a proportion of your spiritual coffers ought to be filled with this nature stuff in order, and it's grounding because it's like an ultimate truth. It predates the technosphere,
Yeah, and I think my experience of talking to people about Vita is they all get that feeling of looking at, whether it's just a tree in full flower or a beautiful sunset or something like, they get that feeling of it just hits you in the heart. And what they don't usually do is connect that with a sense of spirituality. And so this idea of the spiritual coffers is a great one, because I think people could really resonate with that it feels a part of them that nothing else seems to fill. Yeah.
I was in France recently, as you know, at this residency, and we did a trip to La Salle 4, which is the cave. It's a replica of a near perfect replica of the cave that was full of 900 paintings by the Cro-Magnon people. I had a really moving experience stepping into that cave. I mean, I had tears coming out of my eyes. And it took me a little while to sort of sit back and process what was it about that place that made me, give me that emotional response. And I think when I come down to it, it was getting back in touch with the native human being. So, we've grown up, like I'm 55, for example, but I've grown up surrounded by motor cars and houses and ideas of religion and God and all the rest of it. And when you step into the cave that the Cro-Magnon had painted, you sort of step back 20,000 years, way before any of the modern philosophies, way before any of the modern technologies. And you get a sense of who we are in a sort of a native sense. And it gives that clarity about all of the other layers that are in our heads and our hearts, if you like, that are kind of not part of that natural man. So naturopathy quite often is focused around a lot of traditional medicines, sort of indigenous medicines and so forth. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, it's defined as a traditional European medicine. It's a traditional medicine system that originates from Europe. It branches originally from Hippocrates. It just at the point where biomedicine branches through Enlightenment to a very reductionist, mechanistic approach. Naturopathy stayed a lot more oriented to the complexity and holism. And so there was a branching that happened, and that was actually at that point that we defined naturopathy as beginning, but actually its roots stem back to Hippocrates. So,
so who's Hippocrates? He's Greek.
Greek, yes, the father of medicine.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, so the Hippocratic Oath, people often have heard about. He was from ancient Greece. And he described things in terms of humours and those sorts of things. But you look at some of his teachings and his practices about what helps people in their health. Just healthy diet and getting out and having exposure to fresh air and nature was a key part of his therapeutic, armament.
Yeah.
And so I think over time, man has overvalued our ingenuity to the detriment of recognizing what nature already has to offer. And so naturopathy is is in a very unique position because it stems from that connection with that has that shared roots with biomedicine.
Yeah.
So we actually understand biomedicine very, very well for a traditional medicine. But we also really move to have a balanced approach of adopting new science and new information as it comes through, but still practicing it within that philosophical and principles-based framework.
Yeah. You mentioned biomedicine. That's specifically like plant-based medicine as opposed to some of the more synthetic stuff.
So biomedicine is conventional medicine. It's pharmaceutical medicine. It's the medicine of today.
Right. Okay.
So no, biomedicine is the medicine of today.
Okay, right. And of course, Hippocrates would have been advised by cultural, health traditions that go back, obviously, that preceded him way back. So he was around 3,500 years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so and if you go back to say the Cro-Magnon, I don't know enough about Cro-Magnon society, but they would have had their own. Assuming that humans had evolved as modern humans around 200,000 to 300,000 years ago, you've got nearly 200,000 years of finding solutions in nature to deal with ailments that the Cro-Magnon would have had available to them. And then, of course, you've got the Ice Age, and then years pass. And then Hippocrates comes along, and of course, they didn't have written language. And that was also something that was unique about the Greek. It was one of the first cultures that actually had written language and therefore documents that could be left and looked at thousands of years later, right?
Yes. I mean, Chinese medicine or Chinese were documenting around that time as well. So they have a long history as well, but absolutely. That's where the idea of prehistory versus history is when things start getting right down. There's also a lot of, in Europe in particular, the Celtic communities, they chose not to document. They relied primarily on oral tradition on purpose because they felt that there was too much. I think too much is open to misinterpretation. If you wrote it down, someone could pick it up and read it out of context. Whereas if you're teaching people, they get all of the context and they ensure that whoever they're saying it to gets all that context as well.
Yeah.
So what was happening around that time is you would have the Greeks. The Greeks heavily influenced the Celts as well. And the Celts were obviously very nature-based spiritual practices and culture. So there's a lot of a mix happening in that area. And the original kind of identified forefather of at the point at which naturopathy became clearly its own practice in medicine was a German-based hydrotherapist, Benedict Lust, and but they draw still on a lot of Mother Hildegard von Bingen, who's another German nun from, goodness, I'm trying to remember, is it the 1300s? Might even be earlier than that. And she was a very, very intelligent woman, very spiritual, very intelligent, and she did a lot of work in codifying how we can use the natural world for health and healing as well.
Yeah, actually, say her name again. Hildegard of what?
Hildegard von Bingen, Bingen.
Right. Okay. I'll tell you a funny story. So a friend of mine who I met in Bellingen a couple of years ago told me about this woman who was she's a monk or something?
Oh, a nun. Yeah.
Yeah. And who was probably the best example of the intersection between nature, the way that Vita Sapien would describe it, and Christianity. And she shows up in the literature around naturopathy. Okay. And the thing was that I actually forgot her name and I started searching what the hell's her name, Googling her, trying to find this monk woman, this nun. And I sent an email to my friend, but he hasn't responded because he's really busy. And I'm like, she's back.
Well, I tell you what, I just bought this special issue in Dijon in France when I was just there of all dedicated to Hildegard von Bingen. It is written in French, so I'm not really sure if it's much use to you, but if I can get anything useful out of it in my own meager French, I'll let you know.
Yeah, no, I might just look her up on Wikipedia to start, rather than learning French. Okay, that's really interesting stuff. Let me just have a look at my notes. That's quite fascinating. Is there the way that when I go onto say Google Scholar looking for science papers on spirituality, I often find that a good chunk of them are coming out of medical practice. So would there be a sort of a distinction in the way that naturopaths deal with spirituality versus the more biomedicine traditional approach, or is it sort of grounded in the same space?
I honestly couldn't say in a definitive way, and that's just the researcher in me hedging my bets. But because ultimately there's it's not something that naturopathy has focused on collecting information about when I practice in this regard, because most of what we've been doing historically when we've been undertaking research about our practices has been collecting information about the stuff that medicine are mostly interested in. And there's actually not a lot of focus on that at this point in time. What I can say is that things like yoga and meditation and some of those mindfulness practices are really important for tools within naturopathic practice. So I think that there's that broader practice of finding ways for people to center and even if it's not necessarily they're presenting with anxiety, but just even understanding that having people be calm and centered helps their digestion that's kind of that holistic complex thinking that naturopathy does in its part of its way of helping people through healing.
Okay. And there's a theory called terror management theory. Do you deal with that?
No, I haven't heard of it. So
it's not about terrorism. It's this idea that as the human species evolved, there would have come a point at which in the evolutionary process where we became conscious of the fact that we would one day die, right? So something that the other animals don't have is that, well, we don't believe that they have a consciousness about the fact that they're going to one day die. Everything's going swimmingly, and the next minute they're dying. It's the first insight they have to it. And terror management theory sort of posits that at that point of developing the awareness of one's mortality would have created a sort of like a paroxysm of terror. It would have created terror, and it would have disturbed the individual. And what they're saying was that the terror management theory holds that this is sort of the origin of religion. And it's this idea that if one has a worldview and they're living in accordance to the worldview, then that makes the concept of dying so much more palatable.
Right.
So, and it's sort of taken to the extreme with the Christians, which says that if you follow the worldview of the Christians, then you go to heaven for eternity, which makes the whole idea of dying actually kind of not such a bad thing after all, right? Yeah. But just coming back to the point you made about this sort of unease that your digestion is going to be, you'll digest your food more proficiently if you are relaxed, then part of being relaxed is living in accordance with the worldview. Yeah. And I guess really that's part of what I've been trying to do in Vita is to try and write a worldview that gives the human race the best chance of surviving the 21st century.
Yes.
So it's got to be a worldview that's grounded in dealing with climate and ecological collapse, which is our life support system.
Yes.
Okay. Oh, okay. That's great. This is good stuff. How about we stop here, okay, and then maybe come back and have another conversation down the track when we've got some more thinking and ideas and different areas to explore.
Yeah, love it.
Okay, great.
Right. Thanks,
Thank you, Amy. Thanks very much.
You're welcome.
Bye-bye. Ninka, you're in Holland right now. How are you going?
Yes, pretty okay, I guess. Thank you. Okay. Thank you, Guy.
Now,
Nice to be here.
You are a master's student who is doing writing a thesis on deep adaptation. Am I correct in that?
Yes.
Okay, and so I want to have a conversation with you about deep adaptation, and then I want to talk to you about the Titanic.
Great. Yeah, sounds good. Sounds good to me. Yeah.
Okay, so for those of us out there who don't know what deep adaptation is or where the idea came from, do you want to give us a little intro to that?
Sure. Yes, I guess I've been looking at deep adaptation now for a few years, but first more on the sidelines, sometimes participating in some workshops, and later on now for my thesis. And I guess what I'm finding is that deep adaptation, in a way, is a sort of lifestyle. So there's a professor, Jem Mendel, who was a professor in sustainability. And in 2018, after like many years working in the sustainability sector, he came to a point talking to climate scientists, thinking, are we actually gonna do this, or are these systems are we unable to stop sort of the trajectory, the environmental degradation, the climate change that is happening, and are our systems maybe going to collapse? Like, he didn't pose that as a certainty, but he did say in that first paper that, you know, it might not be so far out there for things to start unfolding. So he was really making the case for not just using mitigation, but really starting to look deeply at how we're adapting to climate change and how we are adapting in our own lives, and how we need to maybe ask ourselves, are we living the way we want to live? Now, from that can, of course, come a more sustainable behavior in the end. So in that way, deep adaptation, I feel, speaking to many people now in sort of the deep adaptation movement, because sort of a movement appeared from it. No, there was this. So Jem Mendel wrote a paper, but that wasn't published. But then he published it, I guess, in his own terms, and that got sort of viral. Like, many people in the world read it. And I've interviewed about 20 people, and I've spoken to more people, just sort of in the process, and basically all people say, when they read that first paper, they felt recognition. They felt like, oh my God, somebody's saying, oh, might it be too late? You know, somebody uttering these words, because it seems to be that there's so much focus on mitigation of climate change, and so much focus on whether how fast things are going to happen, and whether we are in time, and that it's 5 to 12 and la la la. And nobody seems to be saying, well, is it actually, 5 past 12? Are we, I think a lot has changed. This was 2018. Things are moving so fast. No, we're 2022 now, and COVID also happened. That wasn't there at that time also. And actually, there's been recent research which says that many people, at least in Europe, that research has been done, that many people are collapse aware and are believing that there's some kind of collapse that will happen. And that was about 60%, I think, in that research. I can't quote who that research was, sorry. I would need to look that up. But I think 20% of those people actually thought it was going to happen near term, which is still a really big number, I think, if you would ask people on the street. So many people say we're collapse aware, especially, I think, now even more with the whole thing in, the war in Ukraine happening after COVID. The price is rising. No, people are, and there's this massive hunger now, of course, as you are aware, probably also in Africa, like worse than ever, sort of. Mm-hmm. And so another thing that people in the deep adaptation movement say is that collapse is already happening. It's not like it's it's going to be somewhere in the future. But for many people in the world today, it's already happening.
Yeah.
And what I've also found out, or what I feel, is that for many people, when they are aware of, my God, maybe we're too late, or even if we're not too late, the damage to the earth and to the environment is so big, and the adaptation needed from people to live with higher temperatures is going to be so big. There's a massive grief happening to people. And then in that process, I think the deep adaptation movement is like a container that provides a group of social care. So it's really a caring group of people that want to, when people become collapse aware, not that it has to happen. By the way, I think it's also very important, as I mentioned, that almost nobody mentions human extinction. And there's like I think a misunderstanding of deep adaptation that goes around where it's sort of put in the human extinction box. And many people, the people I met, it's also important to say that I wanted to know what deep adaptation was for them. And for those people, they're not thinking about human extinction. They're just thinking about the difficult road ahead, basically, for humanity and for other species. And how do we thrive? How do we sustain ourselves and others? And how do we care for others who come to the same conclusions and who might get into pain, whether physical, mentally? So I think the movement offers a space where people can freely talk about these subjects, where it's not suppressed, where we cannot say, oh, we cannot talk about doom or gloom, because then, we will get too negative. I felt, on the contrary, people in the movement seem to be more active and seem to be more willing to change, because everything is allowed, because they're allowed to talk their deepest fears, their deepest worries. And nothing is brushed under the carpet or said, oh, we need to have more hope because if we go into difficult stories, then we give up or something. Yeah.
Where does spirituality fit into this, would you say?
Well, I think that is mentioned for sure as a not per se, because spirituality is always a difficult word. No, it's you can fly off with the angels, or you can have your hands in the earth and create a garden. It goes between those things. No, what is spiritual? But I did feel that, or I did hear people say that spirituality was a part. Not for everybody I interviewed. For some people, they didn't. That wasn't necessarily why they came. They felt it was more factual or more practical way of living, and really hands-on. How do I create gardens? How do I mobilize my community for change, for adaptational change also? But there was the spirituality seems to be a component, as in, I would say that is in restoring our relationship with the natural world. So making it bigger than just humanity, but our connection with the world, no?
Right. Okay. Yeah. So it's sort of like the wake-up call that calls upon us to recognize our innate spiritual connection to nature that we've lost through our Western culture.
Yes, it's exactly that, and a lot of in the deep adaptation movement, there's a forum, and you can there's a lot of workshops, or I'm not sure workshop is the word, but there's a lot of meetings. It has been also because of COVID. A lot has been online, and also because people live all over the world. There's a lot of online meetings, but some of them specifically have a more spiritual connection, or a more connection to how do we restore our deeper feeling for the earth, and in that way. Through that, we might be able to create more care also.
Yeah.
And in a way, it's like Joanna Macy, they use a lot of, I think, from the work that we connect from Joanna Macy, who's really about this love that we can have, for our surroundings. And that love is spiritual, if you would call it like that, no? It's not mechanical, it's not technical, it's not economical. It's sort of life force. It's what sustains us. And I think the transformation that deep adaptation also is hinting at is going back to that species that we were and that we are originally, in connection with everything. Now it's like Gaia theory also. It's we're connected to everything. And if you can contact that connection yourself through meditation, often helps, or through deeper inquiry, mindfulness practices. There's also a quality that can appear in life, which I'm hearing from people in the deep adaptation movement, that actually gives them sort of courage to go on, even though it's difficult times, and also gives them a broader sense of meaning and of care. But also for themselves, a broader sense of meaning, of just having a play in this web of life, basically. If that makes sense.
That term meaning comes up a lot as one of the sort of entryways into a conversation about spirituality. Is that, one of the spiritual aspects is what we see as the meaning of our life, whether we think it's been imposed by others or something that we've created. And I understand how having a deeper awareness of collapse and what's necessary to survive it would help to stimulate people to find meaning in their life, to be have meaningful lives, helping others and sharing the news and speaking and so forth.
I mean, it's when somebody contracts a very serious illness, or even on a like that you hear from doctors that it's not curable anymore. I mean, people go through a huge transition from that. Not all people, of course. And I think also that's important to say that I think people that feel drawn to deep adaptation also have dealt with, are looking at these issues in themselves. Can I cope? Can I cope with difficult news? And if I cope with it, how do I respond to it? And how do I care for others who might not be able to cope with difficult news? So I'm not sure if deep adaptation, it has to be, in my opinion, it has to be brought very gentle, because if people are not, you have to be emotionally capable to hold really difficult news. And if you're not, like somebody who's dying of a disease, you could stay in denial, of course. I think that's where a lot of humanity, or Western humanity, is, at least in some part of denial, because of the inability to cope with difficult news and pain, basically.
And look, that is part of our culture. There's a phenomenon called the Cassandra effect, which is something that's inbuilt into humans, that we are disbelieving of bad news, and we don't like to we don't like to hear it, and so the bad news builds up and up and up and then breaks through the door. And then, of course, like you're saying, that some people that just aren't able to emotionally accept what you and I would accept, having a scientific understanding and having read deeply into what's projected and how the structure is working. That we've gone through the phases of it, that we can deal with it now, where you bring the average person in from the street and you sit them down and impress upon them that you know what you're talking about, and then tell them this stuff, meltdown. And I think that's where what you're saying is that the deep adaptation movement is a social safety net for people to have those conversations.
Exactly that. It's a social safety net, and it's also a place, if you're in grief, in a way, dealing with difficult emotions on your own is almost impossible. It's really, that's like, how do you say, that's torture. If you go through difficult emotions, be it collapse emotions, be it, I mean, now people, Europe with this enormous heat wave, people are getting worried, they're afraid, they're literally in physical or mental despair sometimes, because of, worried about the future, young people being worried about the future. And if there's no holding space for all these emotions, if you're not held, I mean, most people have gone through grief in their lives. If you have to do that by yourself, that work, that's torture. It's you need a loving space that holds you. And I think that deep adaptation really wants to offer that. And also, that's possible. And what I want to mention is that I've been looking and comparing at the latest IPCC report on adaptation. So I've been comparing that with what I'm seeing happening in deep adaptation, what I'm reading, and what IPCC is telling about deep adaptation. And for me, what is so striking is that where maybe the IPCC was sort of catching up still to that point, they use now a lot of the same language that is actually used in deep adaptation. So the IPCC is talking about, we need a transformation, we need a change of meaning giving, we need to listen to indigenous people, we need to listen to other ways of knowledge. We need to, it's really calling for a transformation of our societies. And it's also, in a way, it doesn't put it bluntly, but it does say if we don't change our current trajectory, then there is a possibility of societal collapse. So the language is almost, the words emotions are maybe not so much used in the IPCC because it's still sort of stark, scientific written, no? And I guess science doesn't, But even, I just found that striking that they seem to be meeting each other. And that IPCC seems to be almost calling for groups and for people to start to adapt and to take that on board and to do something with that. And they have a huge section on mental health also. On how we need supportive structures to help people there.
All right. Hey, listen, I've actually there's a deadline on my screen here. This thing's going to turn off in just short of a minute. So can we just wrap up in a minute? And actually, let's just wrap up now, and we can come back and have another conversation. Just by saying thanks very much for that. When are you supposed to be submitting your paper?
End of September.
Oh, okay. So it's coming up soon.
It's coming up. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I shouldn't be taking any more of your time. You need to be pressing the keys and doing your research.
That's okay. It's okay. It's a massive progress and process. Actually, while finishing the important thing is that I felt that through this process I'm living deep adaptation. And through all these talks I have new insights myself, and I'm actually putting them into the world, which is so interesting. So it's like living this deep adaptation is living with this constant change and grief, but also putting more care in the world around me and for the humans around me and for the animals. And it's really interesting.
Okay, good work. Excellent. Okay.
Let's see. Thank you,
I'm going to close this off now and come back to you shortly. Bye. Paul, how you going?
Doing as good as anyone can in this world.
Yeah. Hey, I got a bunch of stuff. You'll notice that I'm fully branded compared to last time we spoke. This
three balls in a circle.
The symbol's called the Quen. It's the symbol that I ascribe to the Anthropocene epoch. And
so what processing people?
What's that?
To which processing people?
The Anthropocene.
Oh, the Anthropocene.
Anthropocene, yeah.
It's a picture of three drains, I hope, because that's what the Anthropocene represents. three sewage pipes. I'll tell you the symbolism. The lower two rings represent the biosphere and human civilization, and the outer ring represents a sort of continuum, but the continuum's broken because of the relationship between the humans and the living planet. That's the symbolism of it. So, this is part of Vita Sapien, which you can see named there. And so Vita Sapien is an attempt to sort of approach the climate and ecological crisis through spirituality, not woo-woo and crystals, but just through that deeper understanding of meaning that people have for their lives. So some people see meaning in money making. They're going to behave differently if they have a meaning that sees themselves as part of nature. Well, we started out our big success came from being cooperative and having empathy.
Yeah.
And now we're mostly looking at our cell phones, not cooperating. And certainly in the US, at least, although you've had examples in Australia, not very big on empathy.
No, exactly. Selfism and the focus on a spiritual connection to consumerism and personal wealth and things. Yeah, so that's what the brand Vita Sapien's about. Is just trying to approach the climate and ecological crisis, but using spirituality as a frame of reference. One of our little principles is this idea that, and this is not a piece of science per se, but more of spiritual belief, that all the living things on the planet are effectively a single organism. Now, there's
a superorganism view.
Superorganism, yeah. A term that I like to use, and this is just me liking fancy words, is omni-holobiont. I kind of put those two things together. A holobiont being like an assemblage of organisms. And so,
yeah, go on.
And so the omni, it sort of suggests the all. So it's the entire assemblage of all of these organisms to create a single. Does that make sense biologically, or am I just making stuff up here?
A mix. In other words, biologists think a lot about ecosystems and communities, and anybody who thinks about Homo sapiens, badly misnamed, I have to say.
Absolutely.
That a single individual means nothing. In other words, people can only really exist in cooperative groups. So it makes a lot of sense that way. It doesn't mean you're physically fused, but your fates are permanently fused.
Yeah, the fates are intertwined. Yeah. So I went through this thought exercise. If we were to assume, not so much biologically, but spiritually, that all the living things on the planet were a single organism, that makes us humans cells in a body. And then the question is, what is the name of that organism? What would be the binomial for the single organism that makes up all the life on Earth? And
well, you got to go back a little bit in scale, because, of course, you may have more bacterial cells in you than human cells.
Yeah.
So you're already a composite of numerous life forms. You have not just bacterial cells.
Yeah.
You've got undoubtedly fungal cells and certainly viruses.
Yeah.
And so on. Some of them can do you harm.
Yeah.
And some of them can do you good. I probably shouldn't put this in your podcast, but we're studying what happens when populations go extinct, working with two colleagues on that problem. And one of the best examples we have comes from the overuse of antibiotics, which can kill off a lot of the helpful bacteria in your gut. And when you kill them off, a nasty bacterium called Clostridium difficile is able to invade.
Right.
And if it invades, it can kill you. And it's very difficult to get rid of because it's developed resistance to most of the antibiotics. And in fact, the standard treatment now, if the antibiotics fail, is a fecal transplant. You get feces from somebody else that reintroduces the populations of helpful bacteria that originally kept the difficile out.
Yeah, right.
So it may sound nasty, but we're learning more and more about what those gut bacteria do for you. And there's even what's now called a gut-brain connection. And the neurotransmitters that are produced in your gut can change your moods and so on. It's getting to be very interesting, very complicated, and makes us look less and less like separate entities.
Yeah. Which lends further sort of weight to the idea that everything combined forms a organism, super organism of its own. Hey, I wanted to talk to you also about a couple of things. Firstly, human population. I was just looking at a human population clock a moment ago. I might just bring that up on the screen because it's quite telling. Where is that? I don't know where that is.
You got more faith in Zoom than I have.
Yeah, that's right. I'm going to need to go and just activate something. Stand by a second there. If I go and here we go, population. Actually, let's not do that because I had a screen up that actually had like a counter running, and it was showing something like 160 million births a year, and around, no, this is year to date, so this is total, righto. So we've got around about 90 million extra human beings on the planet every year at the moment, right? And so my question is, are we seeing that our human growth is actually starting to, the rate of population growth is starting to slow because the pressure is ramping up from all of these climate disasters and heat waves and all of the pressures on humans? Are we actually starting to see the human population growth start to slow yet?
Well, we are seeing some slowing, particularly in developed countries. Some of them are going to start shrinking, are actually starting shrinking. But of course, there's a huge potential for growth. But the biggest problem is 8 billion people are many more than the planet can support permanently. We are living on our capital, and every scientist who doesn't have to take off his or her shoes to count up to 20 knows that virtually every single existential problem we're facing is connected with having too many people.
Yeah.
And I'm a very social guy. I love people. I actually am charmed by babies. But if you want to have a maximum number of people live, what you want to have is a smaller population that goes on for many millions of years, rather than try and cram as many people into the planet as you can now until it just busts. And every single colleague I have thinks a collapse of civilization is in the cards.
Yeah.
And if you look at, well, of course, many years ago, Gandhi was asked what he thought about Western civilization. And he said he thought it would be a good idea. And as you can see in the United States today, dramatically, but you've seen in Australia, having thugs run the country and be powerful is not a way to have a nice, cooperative, empathetic society. And we're pretty depressed here.
Yeah. Where do the best world population numbers come from? Is that coming out of the UN?
The best, I think, are the Population Reference Bureau, which builds on the UN statistics, but the UN statistics have in the past had some problems from the fact that they have to accept the numbers given by governments.
Right.
And governments tend to Mickey Mouse around with the numbers, just like if you're going around asking leaders of say states how many people they have. If they want more aid, they're likely to inflate the figures. And if they think too many people is causing a pandemic, they're likely to reduce the figures. So the Population Reference Bureau, which you can find by Googling it, has some very good demographers who try and take into account some of those little political moves, and I think do a pretty good job of it. Their projections have been quite good in the past, and at least they're doing it as scientifically as you can, considering the sources of data.
Yeah, and that number at the moment assumes around about 7.9 billion.
Yes, I think it's November. They're going to take us through the 8 billion mark. Right. The most recent estimate of how many people might be supported in the long term at, say, roughly a Mexican standard of living, an intermediate standard of consumption, was Partha Dasgupta, who's the best economist on the planet at Cambridge University, Sir Partha, actually. And he did a huge study for the British government, and he's been working on it hard. And his estimate came up with you might support 3 billion people in the long term, which is not far. Ann and I and Gretchen Daly, one of our colleagues, estimated 1.5 billion, leaving some room for mistakes. But the basic point is nobody who's looked at it closely doesn't think we have too many now. So the issue is, how do we start humanely shrinking the size of the population? And that'll give us a lot of time to figure out where the shrinkage should stop. Do the in the projections from the United Nations on human population, are they tying in with the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and putting in, when they talk about unfortunately, although anybody can see that the number of people is in several ways connected dramatically to climate change. That is, the more people you have, the more greenhouse gases are produced. For example, about 35% of our greenhouse gases come from the food system. Curiously enough, the more people you have, the bigger the food system, and so on. But because of craziness in human culture, people refuse to recognize that numbers of people are a huge factor in climate change. The climate disruption is going to end up killing. It already is killing people with the heat waves and the fires, but that's going to get much, 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 much worse. And sadly, it's not faced. I met with a colleague who works with the IPCC, the international organization that looks at climate. And this lady she's a wonderful scientist, had a hell of a time getting population even mentioned in the IPCC report, even though everybody who works there knows perfectly well that population is one of the major problems.
Oh dear. Okay, well, that's sort of not exact. I sort of expected an answer a bit like that. So, hey, now can I talk briefly about this Convention for Biological Diversity? So my organization, Vita, Sapien, has actually been accepted as observers for this COP15 event that's coming up now in Montreal. And they're talking about the Kunming Declaration. I have a copy of it where they're going to sign it off. And one of the parts of this declaration is to put aside 30% of the world's land mass for biodiversity conservation, national parks. Are you across all of this stuff?
Well, I'm not a great fan of saying how much of the earth we have to put aside and the various things that we have to do to save biodiversity. I'm totally in favor of all the groups, including I'm involved with several, that are struggling in various ways to protect biodiversity in some spots. But the main thing that is getting rid of biodiversity, the main thing is too many people consuming too much, creating too many poisonous chemicals that are everywhere and are in our bodies, as well as in the bodies of polar bears and so on and so forth. As long as you have growth maniacs running countries, as long as people think more is better, you're going to get rid of biodiversity. In other words, the basic problem is shrinking the scale of the human enterprise. Human beings and our domestic animals, mostly cows, make up something like 96% of the weight of mammals on the planet. The other 4% being the wild things, the wildlife that is disappearing at a rate that is horrifying. And not just the big animals, not just the elephants and the deer and the moose and so on and the bears. It's also the insects that we're utterly dependent on and which are disappearing at a horrifying rate. And so I'm greatly in favor of having meetings, publishing papers, talking about how much land should be put aside. While we talk about how much land is being put aside, the bulldozers are clearing biodiversity off of Australia, for example, which already has lost huge chunks of its marvelous biodiversity.
Yeah.
And you still have moronic politicians who talk about a big Australia and want to see 50 million people or something living in a country that's already vastly overpopulated. And it's my favorite country. I mean, I'm a part-time Australian. Okay. I love Australia. I know the Australian birds better than I know the birds of North America. I'm dying. I'm in Oz withdrawal at the moment because we haven't been over to see our friends for almost 3 years. We're hoping to come back in October if we can handle the COVID and the travel at our age.
Yeah, right.
Didn't mean to rant at you, but I'm working all the time on the loss of populations and what that means to us as human beings as we exterminate our only living relatives in the universe.
What's the can you give me some back into this insect apocalypse, the insect decline? What are some of the numbers?
For instance, I could send you literature on it, but one study, I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was of flying insects in southern Germany in the last few decades. Half of them have disappeared or more. In some places, 90%. Yeah. When I was a kid, which was, of course, about 500 years ago, when I drove to a bar at night when I was 17 in the eastern United States, I'd drive through a storm of moths. And when I get to the bar, around the neon sign on the bar would be moths and other insects in huge numbers. No more. When I did work just 30 or 40 years ago in Costa Rica with light traps, censusing insects, you could put up a sheet and get it covered, as I did in New Guinea, with bugs. They'd come into a light, and there would be hundreds and hundreds of species, each one with a different way it posed and held its wings and so on. No more. All gone. And of course, insects are at the base of many food chains. If you got rid of all the insects, you'd be wading around in feces because they take care of waste disposal for us. Many of them help us get the bad insects and keep them away. And of course, it's the pests that survive best because they have the biggest populations. So as we get rid of insects, it's the helpful and friendly ones we get rid of first. It's absolutely insane.
And what's now, if I remember correctly, that paper you're referring to in Germany, the sampling that they were doing was actually done in like a nature preserve area. Is that correct? So it wasn't actually just it was showing that the population decline wasn't due specifically to urbanization or artificial light.
A lot of my favorite insects have gone away for two different reasons. I used to live in the northeast of the United States, where they have wonderful big silkworm moths. I mean, with wing spreads of 6 inches or so, glorious things like the Luna moth and the Cecropia moth. And they've disappeared for two reasons. One is two pest moths were brought in from Europe, and the little fly they brought in to try and control them enjoys eating the silkworms as much as the pests. And the other thing is lights. Street lights attract them and they die before they get a chance to reproduce. And the whole change of our whole lightscape is affecting human beings as well in ways we're often not sure of, although one of the things it may be doing is helping the new epidemic we have of nearsightedness that may be related to that, or to the fact that kids now spend their time looking at screens that are only inches from their eyes, like you and I are doing right now.
Right now, So, hey,
we're too old to get nearsighted, though.
So can you speak to that artificial night sky brightness or sky glow? Because it's something that I take a particular interest in. I've got a plan to have an annual ceremony where you actually go out into as like full dark, right, away from sky glow. And if you go and get the sky glow thing that you can add on to Google Earth, you can actually sort of map it out and see where it's dark. You've actually got to travel about 4 hours by car to get to full dark in Australia, from Brisbane. You got to go.
I can believe it.
Yeah.
There are some wonderful outback places I've been to in fields looking for interesting birds. Right. And it is wonderful to get to a fully dark place. But of course, one of the things that's killing off birds in Australia and more so in North America is the lighted buildings that attract migrating birds.
Right.
Between pussycats, which of course are a huge factor in Australia, and I've eaten much of Australia's biodiversity. Same thing in North America and Asia and Eurasia, but also the lighted buildings get rid of biodiversity. And it's obscure to me why we should create more greenhouse gases to keep unoccupied buildings lighted. We ought to learn to be peaceful enough that you don't have to, rob places so that people keep them lighted all night. It's insane. Again, why? If Linnaeus were here today, he'd never name us Homo sapiens again. We're not wise in any definition of the word.
No. What would it be? Homo ignoramus or Homo insanicus
or economicus? Yeah,
economicus.
I mean, after all, the financialization of people in the world is only a few hundred years old.
Yeah.
Our basic standard in the past, 400 years ago, a person who was rich didn't necessarily get political power. Got more than the poor did. But even then, there was a start on financialization. And that's the whole idea that some rich jerk who wants to fly a sports car to the moon has got some kind of brains or power just because he made a lot of money. And, you can just tell he's an imbecile. But we judge people by their salaries and by how much money they've accumulated, and we give them power. And it's a big mistake.
What's your reading on the state of the Great Barrier Reef?
My reading on the state of it is the same as my reading on coral reefs in general. And that is the kind that make reefs, the corals that make reefs are not long for this world if we continue on present course, because both warming the oceans and acidifying them screws up the corals. They're dependent in large degree on the algae that give them color to feed them, basically. They contribute to the algae and vice versa. It's a very famous mutualism, and it's breaking down. And I've worked on the Great Barrier Reef. I tell anybody, you really want to know biodiversity, don't go into a tropical rainforest because you won't see the birds. They're moving around too fast. They're too high up and so on. Go on to a coral reef. You don't even have to go down deep. You can just snorkel. And you can see, I worked on butterflies on land, but I worked on butterfly fish on the Great Barrier Reef. Frank Talbot who's still going from he was head of the Australian Museum. He got us models of coral reef butterfly fishes to test the idea that the colors of the fishes were territorial signals. And we found out when we put the models on lucite wands and showed them to the fish that they actually schooled on them. They weren't territorial signals. We had a great time, and there were 30 or so species of butterfly fishes alone that you could census on the reefs and see them in front of your eyes all the time. And those reefs are not long for this world, which is a huge tragedy aesthetically and, of course, biologically, because millions of poor people depend on the fishes of reefs for their protein. It's another horrifying and sad story.
Paul, you've been doing this stuff for 50 plus years now. When you first started in biology, were you aware that this collapse was taking place, or is that something that's crept up on you over your career?
No, it came later. I started around, I would say 1950. And it wasn't clear to me until the 70s what was happening. And we lost populations of butterflies I was studying. And both Anne and I and a guy named Norman Myers wrote books in the late 70s on extinction. And that's when it really came home to us. We knew the population problem was bad, but we did not have a clear view and the data to show that we were losing biodiversity at such a horrendous rate. And of course, in the early days of jet travel, I was able to do field work around the world. And I saw lots of places that were rich with biodiversity. And then 15 or 20 years later, when I got back to them, they were gone. In other words, I've actually seen it disappear here in the United States and in many places around the world, in New Guinea, in Costa Rica, in Australia. It's sad.
I just got my little 10-minute warning, so I've got to wrap this up just in a few minutes.
Well, we could sing a song. One of the things that I would like to emphasize, I think I sent you a paper on it. People have the idea that if we could only go back to 2015, that would be going back to normal. What people don't understand is that modern Homo sapiens, modern human beings, have something like a 300,000-year history. And for most of that history, they were cooperative, small group people, that there was no racism, there was much less sexism, there was much less economic inequality. The people who became the leaders were ones that were good at something. You didn't elect a deadbeat sex criminal as president of the United States. The person who led your hunts was the best hunter. The person who got people to cooperate was the best person at handling differences. The person who gave you medicine was the woman who knew all the plants. We were a very different species. When Europeans invaded North America, the North American indigenous people thought they were crazy. That they worked all the time and obeyed captains, and they weren't used to obeying anybody, and they lived rich lives. So the idea that what we ought to go back to is a super consuming world of 2015, just absent some of the really dull, dumb politicians, that's not a good idea. We need a whole new system and new people running it. Sorry, I didn't mean to give you a sermon that,
No, I come to you for sermons, Paul. The only guy I'd allow to give a sermon. But that late 70s, that's 50 years of insanity, I mean, you can create a problem, but when you realize there's a problem, that's when the insanity kicks in if you're doing nothing about it. And I've often thought that the real problem of climate and ecological collapse is not the problem.
The scientific community keeps warning and nobody listens. In 1993, the World Scientific Academies and a huge group of scientists got together and warned that if humanity kept it up, we were screwed. And it didn't even make the New York Times. I can still send it to you. And it's been reinforced since. Thousands of scientists have gotten together and said, we're overpopulated, we're destroying biodiversity, we're wrecking the climate. Nobody's paying attention.
All right. Okay. Let's leave it there, Paul. And maybe we can have another one of these really cheery conversations sometime down the track.
I'd be happy to. I have a new book coming out in January. I'd be happy to do it then or before.
Okay. Fantastic. Thanks, Paul. I really appreciate it.
It's nice talking to you. Thanks for doing it.
Okay. Bye-bye. Bye.
You take care.
Bye-bye.
And your listeners, be happy, live good lives, drink good wine, Aussie wine. Bye-bye.
Peter Wadhams, how you going?
I'm doing fine, thanks.
And you're in Turin in Italy, where there's a bit of a heat wave, but they're used to it there. I've been reading about heat wave issues in Greenland, and I was just looking at Greenland. I'm actually relatively new to polar stuff, so I'm sort of using this conversation as a learning exercise, if you like. But what I found was on Google Earth. Can you see my screen with the map?
Yes, that's right. That's okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So you've spent some time on Greenland, I assume, over your career as a polar researcher?
Yes, quite a lot over the years, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And what I was reading, what happened recently was there's like a big melt event. So this time of year, you expect to see a lot of ice melting off Greenland, but there's a lot more of it this year. Is that the case?
Yes, everything has changed. In fact, everything's changed in the world. But Greenland in particular, it used to be the case when I used to go there in my youth that you never got melting on Greenland because the ice sheet has an elevation of about 4,000 feet.
Right.
And so when you're standing on the top of the ice sheet, you expect the temperature to be sub-zero all the year round.
Right.
Always has.
Yeah.
But now, suddenly, what started to happen is it warms up enough in the summer months to get melting. And now the entire ice sheet is in a state of melt during the summer. So you're getting huge amounts of waterfalls, streams, rivers. When you stand on the ice sheet in summer, it's not like being in a totally frozen polar domain at all. That's resulting in the loss of a huge amount of ice as meltwater, and that's causing an acceleration of global sea level rise. So
yeah,
it's
sure.
drastic.
And this is a big piece of land. So I just looked at the see if I can find the toolbar. If I go and grab this thing here, this is something in the order of 2,500 kilometers from north to south, or on its long axis.
Yes.
That is a colossal. And you said it's around. Did you say 3,000 meters? No, 3,000 feet. What's the altitude?
It's about 3,000 to 4,000 meters thick.
Right. Okay, so it's about 1.5 kilometers thick, or thereabouts.
Yes.
Okay.
So it's in terms of the ice content. It's certainly the second largest island in the world of ice. It's just smaller than Antarctica, but it's definitely not Vita.
Oh, yeah. Okay. And am I correct to say that if hypothetically all of that ice melted, there's enough water in that ice on Greenland to raise global sea levels by around 7.5 meters? Is that right?
Yes, at least that, because there's some question about how it would happen if it did happen, because as the ice melts, the land changes its shape because the weight of the ice is holding down the landmass. So there'd be some change there, but we don't know how much it would be. So 7 meters is an estimate, but it might be more.
Yeah. Okay. 7 meters. That's incredible. And so there's an expression that I heard a while back, and I think it was the Prime Minister of Finland who said something to the effect of, if we lose the Arctic, we lose the world. So, and there's this sense that this part of the world is so critically important for a stable climate, and yet it is undergoing like really traumatic and dramatic changes right now.
Yes.
And I guess what I'm trying to do is just kind of get my head around that. And the word that I've got that just seems to describe those changes, or what the changes would lead to civilization, is chaos, really. Because we've had this extremely long, the Holocene epoch of relatively stable conditions that just now seems to have just flipped out, just like, things happening that had never happened before, in terms of the melt. And my understanding also is that as the temperature difference between the polar regions, particularly the Arctic and the equator, the temperature difference gets smaller because it gets hotter up there, that you lose the stability of all of those big energy balances, like is it the Rossby waves and the big circulations of air, which basically keep the cold in the north.
Yes, that's true. I mean, that's the big effect which has been noticed since about 2005, something like that, that suddenly people started to see these extreme events going on, extreme weather events, which had never happened before. That is, extreme cold spells, extreme hot spells, and nobody knew what that might be. But then the person who actually did some good research on it showed that, in fact, it is the fact that the air mass over the polar regions has warmed up faster than the air mass over the tropics, and the temperature difference is lower. So with the temperature difference being lower, the jet stream, which blows around the world based on being driven by that temperature difference, that slows down. Suddenly, we don't have a big jet stream blowing around the world. We have a lot of little broken up jet streams, each of which can interfere with the local climate and give you extreme heat waves or extreme cold waves. And there's no way out of that, unfortunately. There isn't. That's not something where we can fix it. It's something we're going to have to put up with forever.
Yeah. Okay. And again, you come up with that whole idea of the big wavy loops in the jet stream, which is allowing warm air to penetrate into the Arctic region and Arctic air to come down, and those loops can actually sort of park and basically leave these like extreme weather conditions for some weeks, potentially weeks. Right? Okay. And then of course we've got the ice. So you've got the sea ice, which in that Arctic region reflects a lot of sunlight away, and so the sea ice is now reducing. And again, just help me with the numbers here. I'm reading, I think, that if we lost all of the sea ice in the summer period, then the amount of additional heat that would be penetrating into the Earth system as opposed to bouncing off back into space is equivalent to 1/3 of the total energy budget, or some ridiculously large number like that. Is that correct?
Yes, it is, because with the ice gone, much more of the solar heat is retained by the planet because it's darker. Suddenly you have dark sea, dark land, where you used to have ice and snow, and that produces a permanent effect again on the planet. Yeah.
And then, of course, as the water heats up, and I was watching one of the videos that you were presenting and some slides that had it looked like a sonar of the seafloor. That had, it's the East Siberian Shelf, Arctic Shelf, ESAS, that was around 70 meters deep, if I remember correctly, but there was a thin layer of, sediment, but below that you're saying kilometers of methane hydrates?
Yes, it's one of the biggest threats that the world faces, but of course, it's not facing it. It's the fact that underneath the seabed in the Arctic shelf regions, that's the Siberian Sea and Laptev Sea, you have this very thick layer of sediment, 2 or 3 kilometers thick, which is not strictly sediment, it's actually methane dissolved in water to form a kind of compound called methane hydrate.
Yeah.
And that stuff it's okay, it stays there so long as there's something on top of it to hold it down. That's the permafrost, which originates in the last ice age. But once that permafrost starts to melt, that's all of that methane is going to start coming out. It's going to turn itself back into a gas and come out. And it's already doing that. We've already got nasty sonar pictures, which you must have seen, of huge masses of methane gas coming out, and the fact that methane levels in the atmosphere are rising more rapidly than ever before is probably the extra methane is probably coming from these Arctic sources.
Okay, and this East Siberian Sea is the area, is that correct, around here where I'm showing on the map?
Yes. I'm not sure if I can point to it, but it's where you're starting from. If you follow round the Russian Siberian coast,
all the way
right up to where it comes to an end. That's the East Siberian Sea at the top there.
Okay.
And then you've got the Laptev Sea, the Kara Sea, but all those seas, as you can see from the map, the odd thing about them is that the water depth is very shallow, about 50 to 100 meters, and that allows the methane to come out. Where you have deeper water, like in the center of the Arctic Ocean, then any methane that comes out doesn't actually get into the air, it dissolves again in the water.
Right.
But if the water depth is shallow, then you're in trouble.
Mm-hmm. And there's a concept called I understand, the clathrate gun hypothesis that says that conditions could be in such a way that you'll have this massive burst of this methane, that there'll be like this really rapid positive feedback. Is the concern that this stuff could go off like fast, or is this one of those just slow time thing that's just going to go on and on and on for generations?
No, I think it's possibly going to go fast, and this is one of those things where the climate, the sort of basic climate people are complacent about that as about everything, and don't realise this could happen very, very suddenly. And it's the fact that the permafrost layer that holds it all down is actually melting.
Right.
And once that layer is melted, or once the pressure of the methane underneath works its way through the overlying permafrost, then you've got, we don't know what it will be, but it would be pretty violent and quite immediate, that within a short time, maybe a year or two, the whole of this methane held in the sediments could come out. And you get a gigantic obvious burst of methane, but also that would cause sudden warming of the whole planet. The estimates are 1 to 2 degrees, which is well, in itself doesn't sound a lot, but if it all happens at once, it is.
Yeah, and so you add the 1 to 2 degrees on top of the 1 degree that we've already got, and then you're.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, can we go to the other side of the planet, which of course we can do in seconds with this technology, down to the Antarctic, where obviously, so it's very different in the Antarctic, predominantly because most of the white stuff you see there is actually sitting on land and surrounded by ocean, as opposed to ocean surrounded by land. Is there some big fundamental difference in the way that this global heating is affecting the Antarctic versus the Arctic?
Yes, there seems to be. The Antarctic has been warming more slowly than the Arctic, and I think it's the modifying effects that of being surrounded by very deep ocean, stretching out to the edge of the world, and it's slowed down the amount of heating that's been happening in Antarctica, but it hasn't slowed it to zero. And one of the things that's been happening is that the most sensitive part of the Antarctic seems to be the ice shelves, which are where the ice sheet itself has sort of squeezed itself out so that it's sitting over water under the coast. And that is unstable, liable to break up. So we've had several cases of complete ice shelves breaking out on the Antarctic Peninsula, and now we've got a danger of an ice shelf further around the coast breaking out. So if an ice shelf breaks out, in itself, if the ice shelf was already afloat, it doesn't affect sea level. But in fact, it does, because usually the ice shelf is is tied to the coastline, and if it breaks up and moves out, then that affects the general global sea level.
Yeah. Okay. And so, and because of that, yeah, like you say, so we've got a deep ocean surrounding the ice as opposed to shallow seas on the periphery of a. And so is it safe to say that the southern hemisphere is just going to suffer less of the dramatic changes as a result of that sort of stabilizing influence of the Antarctic?
Yes, I think it's not going to be suffering less, but it will suffer more slowly. I think the effects like the disappearance of ice shelves are going to be just as dramatic in the end. The same amount of water is going to be released, the same amount of global flooding is going to happen.
Yeah.
But it will happen more slowly.
Yeah. And is there in the atmosphere, is there actually a partial separation between the air in the southern hemisphere and the air in the north, or does it all just completely mix? So if you get the big burst of methane up in the north, does that immediately spread around the planet, or does that basically stay up in the north there?
Well, it originates in the north, but it does spread around the planet, and there's some rather frightening global maps that you can see showing methane levels in the atmosphere, which you can measure very accurately now from satellites. Okay. And it's always showing that the highest level is in the north, in the Arctic. So that seems to be where the methane's coming from. But it does spread right around the planet, and so you do get an increase in methane level in the southern hemisphere as well.
Yeah.
But the north is the driver.
Yeah, and so methane, my understanding now that the total radiative forcing of methane is around about a third of that of the total footprint of CO2. Is that correct?
Yes, it's been growing. This is it's been sneaking up on everybody.
Yeah.
We thought that that's other scientists, not me, Billy thought that methane had been conquered, and the fact that the methane level in the atmosphere reached a stable state about year 2000. Yes. And for 10 years, so it's just stayed the same. And we thought, we've conquered it. It wasn't clear how we'd conquered it.
Yeah.
We conquered it. And then suddenly started to rise again. And it's been rising very rapidly. And it's beginning to vie with carbon dioxide as the most powerful greenhouse gas.
Oh, this is so charming. And hypothetically, if we were to, and again, it's just a crazy hypothetical, but it helps to put a frame. If we were to stop producing anthropogenic carbon overnight, I mean, hypothetically, that could happen through something like a huge sun flare that takes out power grids around the world. But if my understanding is correct, about half of the CO2 that we emit is absorbed through natural processes relatively soon. Is that right? So, through the tree growth and soils and ocean carbon sinks?
Yeah, about 40% goes into the ocean.
Right.
That's been diminishing recently.
Yes. Yeah. So hypothetically, if we were to stop burning fossil fuels, there would be the atmospheric concentration of CO2 would taper off because of those natural sinks.
Yes, gradually it would. Yes.
Yeah, but that's not over. That's not like you're not going to see this. If we were to stop burning fossil fuels overnight, you're not going to see this noticeable reduction in atmospheric concentrations of CO2. It's going to take a lot longer. Is that right?
Well, it's if we immediately stop using fossil fuels altogether, then of course the CO2 level would go down, but slowly, because CO2 stays in the atmosphere for hundreds of years.
Yeah.
But it would slowly go down, but that doesn't mean that the climate would cool down at an equal rate, because there's a big chunk of our climate change that is called unrealized. It's the you're adding CO2 to the atmosphere. You're causing a driving force on climate, which is making it warmer. But that takes a while to develop. So for a while, you've got less heating than you ought to be having. You've got a kind of little bonus, but it only lasts for a while.
Yeah. And of course, there's this. I frame the climate problem as actually having three separate sort of issues. One of which is that we keep belching the heat trapping gas in the atmosphere. Secondly, that there is this massive stock of the greenhouse gas in the atmosphere in the order of 2 trillion tons or something, 1 to 2. I'm not sure how it's measured. And the third one, of course, is that you've got this massive buildup of heat in the system. And so all of this focus that goes on to let's reduce emissions is simply ignoring the other two parts of the problem, as though fixing the one part of the problem fixes it all, where it only fixes part of it. Yeah. I'm stabbing around looking for some good news here, Peter, but you're not helping.
Well, if we could, the good news with which I usually finish my lectures is, if only we could take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, we'd solve the problem. It's no good just emitting less. That just means we warm up more slowly. But if we actually take it out, like air capture or ocean capture, reduce the CO2 level, we're on our way to doing better. So we must do that, but nobody's doing it. People are doing little pilot studies of direct air capture, but nobody's saying, let's do this with all the power we've got and forget about anything else in the world. That's what we should do.
And so do you think there is a potential for, so there's, a couple of the ocean capture techniques, things like the mass planting of macroalgae and the iron ocean fertilization ideas. Do you think these have got, hypothetically, the capacity to actually significantly, to draw like gigatons of CO2 out of the atmosphere, or is it just fanciful to think that they'd be able to scale up?
No, I think they could be scaled up. It's just people seem to be terrified of thinking about scaling up. I mean, it's been years since people have realised that we can take CO2 out of the atmosphere, and just by scrubbing it out and dumping it somewhere. But it's only been done on a small scale. It's just sort of some little thing in Iceland. But we can remove a few thousand tons a year. We should be removing 40 billion tons a year. And then we'll be getting somewhere. But there's something wrong with, well, it's not something wrong with human race, because there is something wrong with human race, but it's to doing with the scaling and the refusal, really, of the people who should be putting all the money in, that's governments and big foundations, to actually do so. And look, I was having a conversation with Dr. Peter Carter the other day as part of this interview series, and my framing of the sustainability crisis, what I sort of came to understand in 2016 when I was thinking, why is it that Western people are so accommodating of the political and economic systems that allow the biosphere to collapse, which is our life support system? It's a suicide mission. There's something sort of spiritually wrong with people, Western people or people en masse. And when I say spiritually, it's to do with like these big stories about why we're here and what are the things that we're pursuing as valuable in our lives. So the pursuit of wealth, the pursuit of power, the pursuit of consumerism, all of these distractions from paying attention to the fact that we're a part of a global ecosystem, and that whilst we're a natural part of that ecosystem, we came here in the same route as the trees and the bees and the whales and the snails. We've got the same sort of obligations here, which is to pursue our life interest in a manner that looks after the well-being of the host. There's something that's, for me, that was like a target area of a place to sort of try and inquire to see if there's leverage there as to, and I was in another interview today, and I made a quote, or I read a quote. I'm just trying to find it. It was from Fernando Cortez, who was one of the conquistadors that went over to South America,
and he was explaining to some of these indigenous people that they were in the process of destroying. He says, "My men and I have a disease of the heart that can only be cured with gold." And I'm like, it's the same problem today across the whole system of power and dynamics in corporate world, in business, in government, is that nobody's paying attention to the ecosystem. And if we can find a way to trigger them to pay an interest in the ecosystem, then that's the pathway, like spiritually connect to nature, right? Then that is a pathway to changing behavior, because ultimately what we need to do, and this from what I understand you're telling me, is that whatever it is, if we're going to do something on a grand scale, we need to do it really quickly. No more mucking around.
Yes. I mean, there's a book, very nice book about climate change, and I'm trying desperately to remember the author, saying that we deals with the kind of spiritual aspects of climate change. As well, we have a duty of stewardship towards the planet.
Yeah.
And that's what we have to do if we want the planet to survive. But it's certainly true that the mechanical things we can do. I mean, there's things we can do that are more spiritual, but mechanically sort of building something and grabbing it and putting things together and making them work, that has to be done immediately.
Yeah.
And that's the removal of the direct air capture methods, dealing with CO2 in the atmosphere, or dealing with CO2 in the ocean, which apparently is cheaper. But we have to do it straight away. We can't just sit around thinking, oh, in 2050, we better get around to doing this. We have to do it now, and nobody's doing it.
They're going to get really busy in December 2049, trying to hit that deadline. Look, I just had my little 10-minute warning flag up. So what I'd like to do is to wind up in a minute, but maybe come back in a few weeks and just to have a little bit more. Is that all right? Because this is so valuable. Okay. Well, let's just wind up. Peter, thanks so very much for taking the time. And we've got about a third of the way through my list of little things that can kill you in the polar regions. We didn't even get onto polar bears. Anyway. Okay, let's talk in a little while, huh?
Yes, okay, fine. Yes, sorry I'm late for this one. But there was a climatic reason, that is to say, the street was jammed with cars, and at the same time, it's incredibly hot, so you can see the link between the two.
Yeah, I get it. All right, thanks, Peter, and let's talk in a while, huh?
Okay, fine.
Bye-bye. Okay. Are you familiar with the philosopher by the name of Glenn Albrecht? Have you heard of that name?
No.
He wrote a book called, he's an Australian guy, and he's the fellow that put the name solastalgia. You familiar with solastalgia? So solastalgia is this name, a word that describes it's solace and nostalgia put together. And it
I think you sent me something on that before, Guy.
So it describes, for example, when people are subject to environmental disaster like bushfires, and they come back to their property and they're at home, but they're not feeling like they're at home because the environment has changed. So this is the term that he's used. And we're coming back to this conversation about evil, and how part of the difficulty that we have is that we don't have proper words to describe the evil that we're seeing perpetuated through this corporate decision making. And so the reason why I'm bringing this up is because I've got the glossary of his book, and I'm just trying to think of the name of the book, and I'm just trying to share the screen. So give me 2 seconds. I've got to change a setting here somewhere. Open system preferences. It's not working for some reason. Anyway, maybe I'll just actually bring it up. He's got a glossary of psychoteric terms, okay? And psychoteric, again, it's all, so he's got this word, for example, eco-agnosy. Eco-agnosy, the lack of knowledge about, hence ignorance of, past ecological states. Euteria, a positive and good feeling of oneness with the earth and its life forces, where the boundaries between self and the rest of nature are obliterated and a sense of peace, connectedness pervades consciousness. That's euteria. So he's actually got, this guy's actually given us the dictionary that we need to be able to properly have conversations about this sort of deeper stuff between humans and the rest of nature. And I'm just having a quick scan because I think there's stuff in here about evil stuff. Just give me a second. He's got this word symbiocracy, a form of government where humans govern for the symbiotic, mutually beneficial or benign relationships in a socio-biological system at all scales. Symbiocracy is a rule for the earth, by the earth, so that we might all live together. Anyway, I'm going to have to come back to this. I'm
reminded that E.O. Wilson, who's still alive, I believe. He was the renowned ecology, biodiversity, in America, maybe in the world.
Yeah.
But he coined the term, and he wrote about it very beautifully. He coined this term biophilia.
Biophilia, yes.
Because he said that he thought that our particular civilization and culture has a biophobia, right?
Right.
In actual fact, not only do we not feel at one with nature or part of nature, we actually have a deep distrust of nature. So I thought his coining the term biophilia was really, really good. I agree with you about language, because language decides on our thinking and our consciousness. I don't think the English language is that good when it comes to that. But we have lost, as I say, we have lost the idea of Mother Nature, for heaven's sake. So if you don't believe, and by and large we don't, right? If you don't believe that the earth is a living being, right? If you don't believe that your coral reef is a living being, the greatest living being on earth, you're not going to get very far with your consciousness as regards consideration and behavior, towards the planet, let alone the future. So it needs a huge spiritual transformation. And I think that's what you're doing. And,
exactly.
It really does need that.
And I wish I could say that I've just created a global spiritual movement. And I think that is absolutely fundamentally what we need. That's the missing ingredient. Let's put it that way. Also, given the dire straits that we're in, we need to try any tool. It needs to be properly tested. And so really, I have a hypothesis that says that if we can appeal to people spiritually and connect them spiritually to nature, that will fundamentally shift their behavior. And that could be the deciding factor on the changing the trajectory away from the abyss. So it's a hypothesis that needs to be tested. So that's really what I'm sort of putting out there with respect to Vita. I don't know, I don't know whether it's possible. I know it is possible, Peter, that people go through spiritual transformations all the time, not individually all the time, but, people come back from war, they're different. People come back from cancer scare. These are the moments where people shift the deepest seated beliefs, and it changes their behavior. So I know that. When I was 17, I was recruited by these crazy born-again Christians for about 10 months. I ran with them and did what they did. And they didn't appeal to my rational mind. They appealed to spiritual issues. They appealed to issues around what I believed was my meaning in life, where I believed I came from, what happened when I died. They appealed to those spiritual things. And when you appeal to people spiritually and they change spiritually, they change behaviorally. And because what we need is behavioral change, it's ergo sum that we appeal to the spirituality, that The problem is, of course, trying to get our head around the language and trying to find the right words and the right phrases. And that's what I've been working on with Vita. And part of my role is not only to convey these ideas, but to try and help increase spiritual literacy, because most people in the West aren't literate to talk about spirituality. They're not familiar with it. It's like talking about ecology, never having had any lessons in ecology. So I've got this sort of dual role, is to try and firstly understand it myself and then communicate it simply, and then look for the tools whereby people can actually undergo this spiritual shift. And the term that I use is ecophany, which is an ecological epiphany, because most environmentalists that I meet, if you actually drill down and ask them when they started caring for the planet and acting accordingly, they can generally point to a specific moment in time or a period in time. So for me, I was 23 years old and hadn't been trained in anything to do with environment. I wasn't religious, I wasn't spiritual, I was just a regular guy working in the oil industry, in international oil exploration around Asia mainly. And I just knew I knew it was wrong to be putting plastic in the ocean. I knew it was wrong. And then because I was in that system that was not only throwing all of the plastic trash from the ship into the sea, we were actually out there looking for the oil to make more plastic to turn into trash to throw into the sea. And it struck me that it was wrong, and that changed my life. And from that, I went on to do environmental science in order to get my knowledge up and that so I know that people can change, and I'm sure that even these oil executives can change. The question is, what is the environment that they need to be in to foster that change, which again is a separate question. That comes down to what we call the awakening programs, is specific programs that people can go into to foster ecophony. And so again, this is the stuff that I've been working on, hamstrung by resources. So everything I've done with Vita is basically done on a smell of an oily rag. We've sort of made some half-hearted approaches towards high net worth people to try and get properly funded. And continuing to do that, but part of the approach is to really try and up the production quality, hence the branding and the backgrounds and the literature and the jewelry pieces, trying to show that we're actually already well underway with this movement, if you like, and that then hopefully somebody can come and bankroll us. I just want to come back to Glenn Albrecht for a moment, because I found the words that I was looking for. So here we are, stuck for a word to describe this unconscionable evil, which I think is the term you used. Glenn Albrecht refers to Terrapthora. Terrapthora is an earth destroyer, and terracide or tierracide is earth murder, the deliberate desolation of the earth such that it can no longer support life and life support processes. So the Terrapthora.
That's interesting, Guy, because I've been searching for that word for quite a long time.
Yes, I know, and you and I have talked about this a few times before.
Yeah.
I'll send you the glossary later on so you can have a read through. But now we've got some words. That's a good term. That's well coined. Yeah. Because there's history behind that word, so it's good. Yeah. I want to talk a little bit more, some science, Peter, this idea of the lag, this idea. So actually, I want to talk about the lag and the aerosol masking effect, because they've got some commonalities in a way. If we were hypothetically to turn off all the fossil fuel generators overnight, obviously we can't do that. It's going to take decades. But hypothetically, if we were, like say, for example, some massive solar flare knocked out power grids around the world and the whole system went dark, we're going to see temperatures increase for generations. Is that correct? Irrespective?
Well, the modelers like to, if they're asked the question that you're asking themselves, the modelers say, "Oh, we've modeled it. If we immediately stop all emissions, then the temperature will go down a little bit, then it'll come up a little bit, and it'll pretty well end the same." Well, that's very, very misleading, and the IPCC 6th assessment cleared that up. And the sixth assessment said, if when we start to deal with climate change mitigation from that point, and I published on this very thing, so I was very glad to, it will take several decades for the temperature to respond.
Right.
So if we can get this, spiritual transformation of the world, and we need nothing less than that, then it's going to take several decades for the temperature to respond to the reduction in our emissions. And the IPCC there is talking about, a rapid crash reduction in emissions. Everything else sort of pales in significance to the sixth assessment and the chair of the IPCC, Hossein Lee, who's an economist, who said at Madrid, I was there at the 25th COP, he said that emissions to the limit to 1.5, emissions have to be declining within a year. And he said, yeah, that's next year, he said. And we were in Madrid in November, December.
Right.
Glasgow, we'd wasted a few more years, and this is how rapid things change. He said that emissions, if we do not put emissions into global decline immediately, 1.5C and 2C will be out of our reach.
Yeah.
So we sort of got to focus totally on that, and then we're going to find out, right?
Yeah.
I don't think the masking has to be any kind of a deterrent.
Yeah.
Of course, we'll unmask more hidden warming the longer we leave it. But in the best situation in the world, it's going to take some time to get fossil fuel emissions down to zero. Oh, and by the way, the IPCC 1.5 assessment and the sixth assessment said that fossil fuel production and emissions had to be practically zero by 2050.
Yeah.
So the IPCC is saying we have to get out fossil fuels.
Yeah.
And but that's what we're fighting.
Yeah.
We're fighting a powerful force.
Yeah.
Which has every intention of keeping us totally dependent.
Yeah.
On burning fossil fuels for energy.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, our governments are very much a part of that.
Yeah.
Because they're still subsidizing fossil fuels. The G20 just had this big meeting in Indonesia, in Bali.
Yeah.
So I'm always interested, of course, in reading the statements of the G7 and the G20. And they had a climate change statement. It was number 9. It was kind of low on their list. But basically, their statements on climate said, we are not going to do anything. Because they said that we promise to phase out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies, blah, blah, blah. Well, they used exactly that same phraseology at their G20 Pittsburgh meeting in 2009.
Right. Haven't really advanced.
These are people who have no intention of seeing fossil fuel production stop increasing. Let alone. And we had a horrible, criminally evil example of that when COVID, you remember, we had that sharp decline in emissions. And in some regions it was down to 8%. It was a big drop. And when we got sort of COVID under control and everybody started realizing, well, we're going to have to recover the economy. You know what, Guy? Everyone messaged the governments, do not do this recovery with fossil fuels. This is your big chance.
Big opportunity.
Put the money on the recovery into the clean, mature, more than mature energy sources. The World Bank said that, published, the IEA, International Energy Agency, published several times.
Yeah.
I read one quite recently.
Yeah.
OECD, everyone.
Yeah.
And you know what the governments did, don't you?
Yeah.
They poured money into the fossil fuel industry. So the what they call the recovery, what they call the rebound, the past year's emissions was the biggest increase in CO2 emissions ever. Ever. So we're in a fight.
Yeah.
We're in a fight.
Yeah.
We're fighting for the future. We're fighting for our survival. But I totally agree with you that leading the fight has to be a spirituality which is one that's going to preserve us.
Yeah. Yeah.
What we have is sort of, well, instead of spirituality, we have consumerism. We have rabid, crazy materialism.
Yeah.
That's what we do for give ourselves some meaning, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, I sort of describe it as a vessel within us that we fill with stuff, and if it's filled with consumerism and mammon, the pursuit of wealth, then you'll have one behavioral outcome, and if it's filled with a love of life on the planet, then you'll have a different behavioral outcome. Just back to the
people need to allow themselves to fall in love with nature. Children do it naturally.
Yeah.
But as Noam Chomsky said, "Oh yeah, we educate all the good stuff out of our children." I thought that was a very great quote. We put them to schools, regiment them, make them into citizens that are going to contribute to the economy.
Yeah.
I had
an experience recently. Since we last spoke, I did a 4-week event in France. It was organized by a group called Life Itself. It's a residency in France in a town called Bergerac, and it was led by the philosopher Rupert Read. Spent 4 weeks living in this.
I'm familiar with Rupert Read.
Yeah, he's great. He just does really good work. Anyway, so we did a field trip because we were an hour and 20 minutes drive from the La Salle caves. The caves with the really intense cave art.
Oh yeah.
So I visited.
Yeah, that's a fabulous story as well.
Yeah, so I visited La Salle 4. So the original cave where the art is has been closed to the public because too many people were breathing in there.
Yeah.
But they created this near perfect facsimile, which is basically this big fiberglass tunnel that you go through. And you actually go to the International Center of Periatal Art, which is the name of the place, periatal being cave art. And it's this modern concrete building, architect designed, and you go up in this big glass elevator and you start at the roof for this tour, and you actually enter this facsimile cave via the roof section. And 1 minute you're outside and you're freezing your balls off because it's France and it's cold. And the next minute, within seconds, you basically step back in time 20,000 years. And it was so overwhelming for me. I was crying. I was standing there looking at this artwork, in this facsimile cave. And it's, the temperature and the humidity and the lighting and the actual, the cave was scanned with the lasers down to 0.1 of a millimeter. I mean, this thing is just as close as scientifically possible to replicate the situation. And it's really long. It's like 2 80-meter long columns. And it's sort of, it's only like 2 meters high and 3 meters wide. It's relatively small. So it's really kind of compacted and just an overwhelming experience. And later on, I was trying to figure out why I was so, I was standing there crying. And, and it's something like getting in contact with man in the state of nature, to use an expression. What is the human experience when you take money and technology and religion and modern society away from it? What is it at the heart of us? And this cave art was produced by the Cro-Magnon people. And so this was 20,000 years ago. So prior to the last ice age. And this is way, way, way before any of the modern axial religions, way before written language. These people were just basically human beings living in nature and expressing their beliefs or their ideas through the artwork in this cave. And it's a phenomenal experience. I want to just relate a couple of points that have just for me really stuck in my mind. There's 900 animals painted in the caves, 900, okay? Only one human. and of
that human's a stick human, right?
Yeah, it's this funny looking creature with this sort of bird head. It's quite bizarre, and it's tucked away down a hole, right? It's like in the least accessible place. Of the 900 animals, there is only a couple of reindeer, okay? And the thing is, reindeer was the main part of the meat eaten by the Cro-Magnon. So most of the other animals were like horses and like woolly rhinos and the big, fast, dangerous animals. So they were sort of painting the animals that they revered or that were out of their reach, if you like. They weren't painting the normal menu. Now, what I found really interesting as well is that the excavations of their fire pits where they would cook revealed that they occasionally did eat these other animals. So they weren't above eating the creatures that they revered. Anyway, it was sort of getting back into that nature. And I can understand why people fear nature, because it would have been pretty hard to survive in those conditions. And I can really understand how now that we have like modern Western societies and we live in houses and we've got police forces and we put the murderers away, although we leave the sociopaths in power, I can understand how people would be afraid of nature. So I sort of empathize with them because it's dangerous, and my understanding of human evolution is that we've gone through a couple of bottlenecks, evolutionary bottlenecks, where the human populations came down to a few tens of thousands of people, nearly disappeared because of nature. So you can see, and so for me, that is part of this sort of spiritual aspect of this, is this fascination and this reverence and this fear, if you like, of nature is all kind of part of why we, why I personally revere it, is because it's dangerous, Anyway.
No, reverence is exactly the term.
Yeah.
In my lifetime, I've seen all the established, big religions agree with the indigenous people over tens and tens and thousands of years, namely that Earth is sacred.
Yeah.
I mean, I've seen that happen. I've seen that had their meetings and have their papers, and that's great. But you have to know Earth is sacred. You have to know it.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that you picked up on the fear. The term sacred, as I understand it, does involve a sense of fear as well as awe.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
We're lucky. I've been lucky in Canada because as a practicing physician, coming from England, I got to know some what I call First Nations people, some indigenous Canadian people. And I got to say now, when I look back on my life, everything that is most important that I've learned from those First Nations people.
Right.
I got to know them quite well. I'd buy their art, their carvings. Their art is absolutely wonderful. And they still know this, I mean, they still know, for instance, in British Columbia and the rivers, they still know that water is sacred.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you can't mess with water.
Yeah.
Just the same, you can't mess with Mother Earth. You just can't do that.
Yeah.
And so we do need this transformation. And I was reminded when you were describing the mission, which is a great mission, that even the IPCC in their 2018 1.5C assessment said, we need a transformation, a change at every single level of our society.
Yeah.
So when I read that, I thought, wow, you got it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Everything about us has to change.
Yeah.
Everything.
That's exactly right. All the institutions.
Certainly our economics, certainly our idea of religion.
Yeah.
Certainly our philosophy. We have to have some philosophy, for example.
Yeah. Yeah.
You mentioned a philosopher.
Yeah.
Very, very important.
Yeah.
You know, to have a philosophy in your life and as you're growing up in your education, so that you have a meaning and a deep meaning and understanding about what life is all about.
Yeah. 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 Peter, I'm going to call this to a halt now. This is really great to talk to you. I love these conversations. And let us have another one soon.
No, I heard that you were you were going to make a film or something.
No, don't know that one. Oh,
okay. All right.
Ideas, man.
Maybe I was just hoping that then.
No, I don't have the means to make a film. I have got a film that I want to make though, but it's going to cost about $30 million. I used to date a film producer years ago, and I wrote a screenplay for a story that I later adapted into a novella called Yongala. And it's a story of a ship that sank in Eastern Australia in 1911. It went down with 120 people on board in a cyclone. They found it 40 years later, close to Townsville. It's one of the best wreck dives in the world, or it was before it got smashed by another cyclone and the substructure destroyed. But anyway, what I did was I wrote a historical fiction story about a professor who developed a renewable energy machine called the Portland Smoke Engine. And he was taking this machine to the Townsville Fair. They were going to run it on bagasse, which is the byproduct of the cane industry. And he was traveling with his young niece, Felicity. And the coal board sent a mercenary on board to murder the professor and destroy the machine. But in so doing, developed an innocent friendship with the 12-year-old niece. And it was the story about this awakening, if you like, of the murderer, the mercenary, as the ship goes into the cyclone and eventually, of course, sinks. Anyway, so that if I was going to make a movie, that would be the movie that I'd be pursuing. So I don't know.
So I got to say, I think I mentioned it on an email. You know, we've had some heart-to-heart, head-to-head communications for a while now, and every iteration of your mission that I've read, they get better.
Yes.
The last one was absolutely brilliant. I just loved it, guy.
Yeah, great, fantastic. That's great. Good testimony. Thank you. Okay, Peter, let's have another conversation shortly. And in the meantime, good luck. I'll talk to you soon.
Bless you, and thank you for the background. Oh my God, it's impressive.
Yeah, just get better lighting, okay? And if you've got a background where there is like a single monochromatic color, you're going to find that the quality just comes. It's just going to pop. Okay.
Brilliant. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you very much. Okay. Take care. Bless you.
So we're here with Peter Carter, who is in Victoria, British Columbia. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah.
How's the weather there? Are you having heat waves like you were last year?
We are not, Guy. For me, we're having the most wonderful, beautiful weather, but it's pretty unusual. It's cool. It's cool, but the sun's bright and it's just wonderful, actually. But it's not how it should be.
Right. What should it be this time of year?
Well, normally, you know, it'd be pretty warm here this time of year.
Okay.
But I have a heat sensitivity, so I always have to stay out of the sun anyway. But you know, it's just lovely, I must say.
Peter, what's going on? Like Europe's under heat wave at the moment, and one of the slides that I saw on social media was a picture that somebody had captured from some years ago, where the forecasters were projecting what the weather would be like in 2050, and it was like 41 degrees Celsius in London. And of course, now it's 2022 and it's 41 degrees Celsius in London. And
I saw that.
Yeah, and one of the phenomena, so I've been doing climate stuff for 20 years. And when I first started, the data that I was using was from the IPCC. and they were projecting all of these nasty impacts of climate change towards the end of the century. And so sort of what we're seeing is this incredible contraction, if you like, in time. And how can we understand that if the best science at the time of a really well understood phenomena was given these projections out towards the end of the century when they're effectively 80 years early? How do we explain that?
Well, the science soon after the first assessment in 1990, which was probably the best assessment, to tell you the truth, the science of climate change switched from what we call theoretical science, right? And ecology and biology, it switched to modeling.
Right.
And as Professor James Lovelock said, and also one of the Russian experts that I spoke to on methane hydrate, models are all very well for qualitative change, to check that your computers say that what you expect to happen, right? Obviously, you have global surface warming, you're obviously going to get heat waves, you're obviously going to get droughts, you're obviously going to get forest fires.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we knew all that in 1990, and we knew that would be definite. But the science really has got more and more and more modeling.
Right.
And it's a bit chaotic, to tell you the truth. You probably remember in 2007 when we had that first big abrupt loss of Arctic sea ice, that suddenly the scientists said, well, wow, this isn't supposed to be happening until 2080, right?
Right, yes.
And then, of course, permafrost has always been one of our big worries, although the IPCC practically ignores it. But the permafrost is thawing in Alaska at a rate that the models project for 2090.
Right.
So we're looking at many, many, many decades in which, there's a saying amongst modelers that models are always wrong.
Yeah, of course.
And oh my gosh, this is certainly proved to be the fact. Now, I may be sounding critical, but actually I'm not, because of that horrible, aggressive climate denial campaign that was started by the by the fossil fuel industry, and they launched that in 1988.
Right.
When they heard that there might be a convention coming down, when they heard that there might be a new group of scientists. And what they did was they attacked the scientists. They literally attacked them. So that put us and science in the situation that we really were compelled to do what we shouldn't have needed to do, but to prove, right, to absolutely prove that climate change was real, right? And it was going to happen, and it was going to increase. But this is so long ago.
Yeah, right. 88. Yeah.
We were out of time about 10 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah. I was watching an interview the other day. It's actually on CNN with a British scientist who works at the geosciences department at the University of Cambridge. And he was saying that he talks regularly to senior executives in fossil